The sun did not just shine, it hammered. Luke, Ava, Ben, Miri, and Nix stood in the center of a white-hot expanse, the air shimmering with a heat that made the horizon ripple like water. Behind them, the abandoned house groaned in the wind, its wood bleached bone-dry by decades of exposure. Applina stood at the front, her gaze fixed on the endless dunes ahead. She gestured toward the emptiness, a sharp, decisive movement that cut through the silence. "We camp here," she said. Miri squinted, his eyes narrowing against the glare. He kicked a pile of dust, watching the grit settle back into the parched earth. "What are we supposed to do in a place where there is absolutely nothing?" he asked. His voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the vastness. Applina did not answer with words. She only offered a slow, knowing smile that made the skin on the back of Ava's neck prickle. The group turned away from the house and began to trek into the dunes, their boots sinking deep into the shifting sand. The dunes were relentless. Every crest revealed only another slope of burning sand, stretching toward a horizon that refused to get any closer. Luke led the way, his breath coming in ragged gasps, while Ben and Nix trailed behind, their movements sluggish and heavy. Hours bled into one another until the sun began to lose its sharpest edge. Then, the landscape shifted. They topped a massive ridge and stopped dead. Below them, nestled in a hollow between two dunes, sat a building that had no business existing. It was a retro-style diner, complete with chrome trim. There were no tire tracks leading to it, no power lines, and no footprints in the surrounding sand. It looked as if it had been dropped from the clouds. The group stood frozen, the wind dying down as if the desert itself were holding its breath. Ava stepped forward, her boots sliding down the loose incline until she reached the base of the structure. She pressed her palms against the glass. She looked back at the others, her face pale. "How is this even possible?" she whispered. The silence was broken by the faint hum of electricity. The door swung open with a heavy, metallic click. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of searing fat and toasted bread. The group crowded into the entryway, blinking against the sudden change in light. Behind the counter stood a woman. She did not look up, nor did she pause her work. With a steady hand, she flipped a strip of bacon on the griddle. Luke stepped forward, his mouth opening to speak, but the smell of burgers and fries stalled the words in his throat. Rhea simply moved to the next station, her focus entirely on the food. She seemed to exist in a different rhythm. The group drifted toward the booths, their exhaustion pulling them down onto the vinyl seats. Plates appeared, piled high with steaming food. They ate with a frantic, desperate hunger, the heat of the meal thawing the tension. No one asked questions. Rhea finally turned, wiping her hands, her expression unreadable as she watched them settle into the warmth. The trek back to the abandoned house felt shorter, the weight of the desert lightened by the meal. As they crested the final dune, the structure came into view, but it was no longer the ruin they had left behind. A makeshift watchtower, built from scavenged timber and rope, rose high against the darkening sky, casting a long, jagged shadow over the sand. Beside the entrance, a row of heavy barrels stood in the shade, condensation beating on their surfaces. Luke reached out and touched the metal. It was ice cold. He pried the lid off one and dipped his hand into the water, pulling it back with a sharp gasp. Mori stood near the base of the tower, his hands covered in dust, watching them approach with a quiet, knowing look. When they pushed the door open, the desert heat did not follow them in. Instead, a wave of cool, stagnant air hit them, instantly drying the sweat on their skin. The house was no longer a shelter. It had become a fortress against the sun. Ava looked at the others, her eyes wide with confusion. The next morning, the horizon shimmered with a heat that promised to drain their reserves. Yet they pressed forward. Following a faint, unnatural breeze, they stumbled upon a jagged fissure in the rock face. It was a cave, tucked away from the sun. They squeezed through the narrow opening, the light fading into a cool, subterranean glow. In the center of the cavern lay a pool. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the ceiling like a polished mirror. It was clear, deep, and utterly devoid of the dust. Ava stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached out. She dipped her fingers into the surface. The water was neither hot nor cold. It was exactly the temperature of her own skin. She pulled her hand back, her brow furrowing. "This is not an oasis," she whispered, her voice echoing against the stone. "It is too perfect." The pool existed in a vacuum, a manufactured miracle that felt more like a trap than a sanctuary. Leaving the cave, the group walked until the dunes flattened into a hard-packed plain. Ahead, a structure rose from the sand, its timber walls weathered and dark, resembling an old-world pub. A sign creaked on rusted hinges as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dry wood and stale tobacco. Behind a long, polished bar stood Raz. He did not look up, his fingers moving with rhythmic precision as he shuffled a deck of cards. The sound was sharp, a rapid-fire clicking. He dealt a hand onto the table, the cards sliding across the surface with a soft hiss. Luke sat down, followed by the others. The tension that had gripped them in the cave began to dissolve, replaced by the simple, hypnotic focus of the game. Raz laughed, a dry, rasping sound, and flipped a card. They played for hours. The desert wind howled against the exterior walls, but inside, the world narrowed down to the flick of a wrist and the turn of a card. The wasteland outside ceased to exist. They stepped back into the house, the transition from the scorching exterior to the interior, air feeling like a physical blow. The desert heat outside was a tangible weight, a furnace blast that turned the sand into a shimmering, white-hot sea. Yet, inside the house, the air was crisp and still. Muri stood by the table, a collection of colorful, frosted cones arranged before him. He held one out, the surface of the ice glistening with a fine layer of frost. The group stopped. They looked at the cones, then at the thermometer on the wall, which was pegged at a temperature that should have turned metal to liquid. Ava reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed the side of the cone. It was freezing. A thin trail of condensation rolled down her palm. She took a bite. The crunch of ice was loud in the quiet room. It was sweet, cold, and utterly impossible. Ben grabbed one, the frost clinging to his skin, and laughed a hollow, disbelieving sound. They ate, the ice chilling their throats. The kitchen became the center of their defiance. They cleared the long wooden table, pulling out supplies that had no business existing in the heart of a wasteland. Luke hauled a heavy slab of beef onto the counter, the raw meat dark and marbled. Beside him, Ben tossed strips of bacon into a searing pan. The sound was a sharp, rhythmic crackle that cut through the silence of the house. Muri worked the dough, his hands dusted white as he shaped the pizzas, sliding them into an oven that glowed with a steady, controlled heat. The smell hit them all at once. The rich, savory scent of roasting fat, the tang of tomato sauce, and the sharp bite of melting cheese. It was an overwhelming, thick aroma that clung to the walls and seemed to push back the very memory of the desert. They moved with a frantic, hungry energy, piling plates high until the table groaned under the weight of the feast. When they finally sat, the room felt smaller, warmer, and entirely removed from the sand outside. Ava took the first bite, the steam rising in the cool air. They ate with a primal intensity, tearing into the beef and savoring the salt of the bacon. Every mouthful was a victory. Outside, the wind continued its aimless, hollow search, but inside, they were full. The wind outside rose to a low, mournful howl, scouring the exterior walls with grit and sand. It was a relentless, abrasive sound that once would have signaled danger, but now, it served only as a reminder of the barrier between them and the void. Inside, the air remained undisturbed. Luke moved to the television set, his fingers brushing the dial. With a sharp click, the screen flickered, bathing the room in a steady blue-white glow. The static cleared, replaced by the hum of a broadcast that defied the geography of the desert. The group drifted toward the center of the room, sinking onto the floor. They did not speak. They watched the flickering images, the light playing across their faces and reflecting in their eyes. The desert wind continued to batter the structure, but the sound was muffled, distant, and ultimately inconsequential. Ava leaned her head back against the wall, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Ben sat cross-legged, his gaze fixed on the screen, his posture relaxed for the first time in days. Muri, Nix, and the others gathered close, a tight circle of warmth in the center of the house. The television broadcast filled the room with voices and music, a domestic soundtrack that drowned out the howling wasteland. They were no longer wandering through an empty expanse. They were inhabiting a sanctuary. The desert had tried to claim them, to erase them with heat and distance, but it had failed. They had built a life out of nothing, turning a forgotten ruin into a place of belonging. As the night deepened, the house stood firm against the dunes, a beacon of light and life. The wasteland was still there, vast and indifferent, but it no longer mattered. They were home.